Is this the kind of place where jokes pour as freely as coffee trays clatter, and an old man stands unnoticed today? They mocked his rank, scoffed, and pressed him with smiles, laughter rippling table to table in the mess hall around them. He didn't answer. Then a worn coin turned in his palm light, catching gold as doors creaked. The room fell silent, heartbeat loud, mirroring shock as respect lifted for everyone watching. Still quiet men leave echoes too. Let me take you back where that coin waits for truth tonight, together. The veterans' mess hall was already loud before noon. Metal trays slid along the counter in short, uneven bursts. Forks clicked against plates. Somewhere near the windows, a chair scraped back and stayed there, as if its owner had forgotten what they were getting up to do. The air carried the mixed smells of soup coffee and something fried that had been reheated one time too many. Long tables ran the length of the room, scarred by decades of use. Men and women sat shoulder to shoulder, jackets draped over chair backs, hats resting beside trays. Voices overlapped in an easy, familiar way. Nothing sharp, nothing urgent, just people filling the space. Walter Hayes stood in line near the middle, his tray balanced against his hip. At 67, he moved a little slower than the men ahead of him, but not uncertainly. His back was straight. His shoulders were relaxed. He wore a plain brown jacket, zipped halfway, the fabric softened by years of wear. Nothing about him asked for attention. He shifted his weight once, waiting. Someone at a nearby table glanced over and leaned toward his neighbor. "Careful there," the man said, smiling. "Wouldn't want to spill your rank all over the floor." The neighbor chuckled. Another head turned. Walter took a small step forward as the line advanced. He kept his eyes on the counter. A second voice joined in, louder this time. "Yeah. Hey, what rank did you say you were again?" That one traveled. Laughter rolled down the tables, hopping from one group to the next. Not mean, not pointed. Just loose humor tossed into the room and picked up wherever it landed. Someone slapped the table lightly. Someone else shook their head, amused. "Well," a woman said, grinning, "guess it still counts for something." More laughter followed. Forks paused mid-air, then resumed. Conversation swelled again. Walter reached the counter and set his tray down. When he did, something small flashed briefly in the overhead light before disappearing beneath his fingers. A coin. Old, smooth around the edges, the surface dulled by years of handling. He closed his hand around it without looking, as if the motion belonged to muscle memory rather than thought. "Soup or chili?" the server asked. "Soup's fine," Walter said. His voice was steady, low, unremarkable. He paid, lifted the tray, and turned toward the long tables. As he walked, the laughter followed him, thinning as it went, but not quite fading. A man at the end of the table raised his eyebrows playfully. "Didn't mean anything by it," the man said. Walter nodded once and kept walking. But the sound of it, those easy jokes, hung in the air a second longer than it should have. At the far end of the room, a teenage volunteer paused with a stack of napkins in her arms. She had been moving between tables all morning, refilling water, wiping spills, learning how to step around conversations without interrupting them. She heard the laughter shift, felt the timing change. It wasn't anger that caught her attention. It was the way the room leaned into the joke together, then didn't quite know how to lean back out. Walter found an empty seat near the center table and sat down. He set his tray in front of him, placed his fork neatly to the side, and slid the coin into his jacket pocket. The movement was quick, practiced. Across from him, someone whispered, "What do you think that was about?" Another voice answered, "Probably nothing." Walter lifted his spoon, paused, and set it down again. He didn't look around. He didn't scan the room. He simply sat there, breathing evenly as the mess hall carried on around him. Still, the volunteer noticed how a few conversations lost their rhythm, how a couple of people glanced toward the center table then away, how the laughter didn't quite restart the same way. But the room stayed loud. Chairs scraped, trays slid. Someone asked for more coffee. And somewhere between the counter and the windows, the joke about rank finished making its way through the hall, leaving behind a faint, unsettled quiet that no one named out loud. Walter had taken 2 spoonfuls of soup before anyone spoke to him directly. "Sir," the woman said, stopping beside the table, clipboard tucked under her arm. She wore a neat sweater and a badge that read Event Coordinator. Her voice was practiced, the kind that stayed polite even when it expected compliance. "We're keeping this section open." Walter looked up. "Open for what?" "For flow," she said. "Helps us move people through." He glanced down the length of the table. There were empty seats on both sides of him. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He didn't move. She waited a beat, then cleared her throat. "I'll need you to relocate to the back tables." Across the aisle, someone leaned over to his friend. "Guess rank doesn't come with reserved seating," the man murmured. A few quiet chuckles followed. Walter set his spoon down. His right hand slipped into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull anything out. His thumb simply found the edge of the coin and rolled it once slowly, as if feeling for a familiar notch. He looked back at the coordinator. "Who decides the order," he asked, "when the room fills up?" She blinked. "Excuse me?" "The order," he repeated. "Who goes first when it gets crowded?" "I do," she said. "That's part of my job." Walter nodded. "Good." The answer seemed to throw her off balance more than the question. She shifted the clipboard to her other arm. "Well," she said, "then I'm asking you to move." "All right," Walter said again. He stood lifting his tray without clatter and stepped toward the smaller tables near the back wall. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. He didn't look at the people who watched him go. Someone whispered, "Did you hear how he said that?" Another voice replied, "Said what, exactly?" Walter sat at a narrow table by the windows. He set his tray down, then reached into his pocket and brought the coin out this time. He didn't study it. He just turned it between his fingers while he listened to the room settle back into itself. Still, the rhythm had changed. The teenage volunteer passed by with a coffee pot. She slowed as she walked, eyes drawn to Walter's hands. The coin moved with him, smooth and steady, never dropping, never clinking against the table. When he stood to adjust his chair, she noticed how he rose straight, balanced without pushing off. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please," Walter said. She poured, careful not to spill. A drop escaped anyway and landed on the table. "Guess the coffee outranks me today," she said, smiling, and wiped it up. Walter smiled back, brief and kind. At the front of the room, the coordinator conferred with another volunteer. She glanced over her shoulder once, then twice, as if trying to place something that didn't quite make sense. A man at the long table leaned back and said louder than necessary, "So what rank you say you were anyway?" Walter didn't answer. He took a sip of coffee and set the cup down. Another man added, "Must have been a quiet one." There was laughter again, but thinner now, less certain. Walter's thumb traced the edge of the coin. He slipped it back into his pocket and folded his hands on the table. The older man in the veteran cap watched from across the room. He hadn't spoken yet. His eyes followed Walter, then moved to the coordinator, then back again. The coordinator approached once more. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice, "we're just trying to keep things running smoothly." Walter met her eyes. "So am I." She paused, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Still, a few conversations had stopped altogether. The teenage volunteer noticed it as she refilled the coffee urn. She noticed the way people were watching now, not laughing, not speaking, just looking. Walter finished his soup. He stacked his bowl neatly on the tray and sat there, hands folded, as if waiting for something to happen or for something not to. The lunch rush thinned without anyone announcing it. Chairs slid back into place. Trays stacked higher at the return window. Conversations softened, turning from laughter to low talk that stayed closer to the table. Walter finished his soup, wiped the rim of the bowl with a napkin, and stood. He didn't head for the exit. Instead, he carried his tray to the return counter and noticed the stack leaning. He adjusted it, aligning the corners so the pile settled. A volunteer nodded her thanks without stopping. Walter moved along the tables, collecting 2 abandoned cups and setting them near the sink. He wiped a small spill with the corner of a paper towel and folded it neatly before tossing it away. When he reached a wobbling chair, he crouched and slid a folded napkin under one leg, testing it once before moving on. No one had asked him to. At the service line, the coordinator was juggling 2 tasks at once, answering a question while pointing a family toward open seats. Walter stepped behind the counter just long enough to straighten a tray rack that had slipped off its mark. "Sir," she said quickly, then stopped herself. "Thank you." He nodded and stepped back out of the way. Across the room, the teenage volunteer slowed her pace. She had noticed him earlier, the way he carried himself, the steadiness, but now she watched how he worked. He didn't hurry. He didn't hover. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, leaving the space a little calmer than he found it. From somewhere beyond the walls, a low hum drifted in through an open window. A choir warming up at the church across the street, voices rising and falling together, searching for a key. The sound fit the moment, soft and patient. Walter paused by the long table, straightened a chair, and turned a stack of paper schedules so the top page faced the right way. He didn't read them. He didn't need to. Then he stepped aside. An older man in a faded veteran cap stood near the windows, coffee cooling in his hand. He had been watching for a while now. Not staring. Watching. He took in the way Walter moved, the choices he made, the absence of anything extra. When Walter passed, the man spoke quietly. "You always do it that way." Walter stopped. "Do what? Leave things better than you found them," the man said. Walter smiled, faint. "Seems fair." The man nodded once, as if a long-standing question had finally answered itself. At the back table, the teenage volunteer finished refilling napkin holders. She glanced up and met Walter's eyes. This time she didn't smile out of politeness. It was something else, respect maybe, though she couldn't have said why. She stepped aside to give him room, then realized he didn't need it. The room settled into a quieter rhythm. Plates clinked. A chair scraped once and stopped. The choir's hum wove through it all, steady and unhurried. Then Walter reached into his jacket pocket, rolled the coin once between his fingers, and let it rest there. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to see it. Then the coordinator approached again, her voice lower now. "We're about to switch service orders," she said. "Just a heads up." Walter nodded. "All right." He stepped back, giving space without being asked. A few people noticed. A few more noticed that others were noticing. Conversations paused, not from tension, but from attention shifting. The older man in the cap set his cup down and straightened. Then someone said the word no one joked about. The laughter was just starting to come back. Someone near the windows let out a short chuckle, testing the air. A chair scraped halfway, then stopped. The sound didn't carry the way it had before. It thinned like a radio signal losing strength. Then a voice spoke. "Chief." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The veterans' mess hall froze. A fork hovered above a bowl of soup and stayed there. A cup halfway to someone's mouth paused mid-lift. The chair that had begun to slide back remained angled, one leg still caught on the floor. No one laughed. No one filled the space. Walter Hayes did not turn right away. The older man in the faded veteran cap stood by the windows, his back straight now, his coffee untouched. He looked not at the room, but at Walter. "Chief," he said again, just as quietly. That was all. The word settled over the tables like a held breath. It carried weight without explanation. It asked nothing. It corrected everything. Walter exhaled slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought the coin out into the open. He placed it on the table between them flat and centered the way it had always been meant to rest. The light caught it properly this time. It wasn't just a coin. Not the way the room now understood it. The surface bore markings worn smooth by decades of handling, edges softened by time rather than neglect. The design was simple, precise, and unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. A man near the service line leaned forward. "That's a chief's coin," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The coordinator stood still, papers forgotten in her hands. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The rules she lived by, schedules, flow charts, seating plans pressed in on her all at once, as if the room itself had tightened. She felt slammed by protocol, not by force, but by recognition, by the sudden understanding that the structure she enforced had just realigned around something older and firmer than her clipboard. "I didn't," she began, then stopped. Walter finally looked up. "You weren't supposed to," he said. His voice was calm, not forgiving, not accusing, simply accurate. Across the table, someone cleared his throat. Another person shifted their weight and then thought better of it. The silence held complete and unbroken, as if the room itself had decided to listen. The older man in the cap nodded once. "That rank," he said, steady and respectful, "isn't a joke here." No one argued. A man who had laughed earlier stared down at his tray. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I know," Walter replied. The teenage volunteer stood near the coffee urn, hands still, eyes wide. She hadn't known what the word meant when it was spoken, not fully. But she understood what it had done. She watched the way the room had shifted toward Walter, without him asking it to. The coordinator set her clipboard on the counter. "We'll open the table," she said, voice lower now. "All of it." Chairs moved again, this time deliberately. Space appeared where there hadn't been any a moment before. Not because someone had ordered it, but because no one questioned it. Walter left the coin where it was. The mess hall breathed again. Conversation returned in careful increments, voices softer, laughter slower to rise. But something fundamental had changed. The easy mockery had nowhere to land now. It slid off the edges of the room and disappeared. Walter sat back down, hands folded, posture unchanged. He hadn't stood. He hadn't explained. He hadn't asked for anything. The trust had moved on its own. And for one long, unmistakable moment, everyone in the mess hall knew exactly why a single word had been enough. The room didn't rush to fill the silence. It eased into it. The event coordinator was the first to move, though she didn't make a show of it. She set her clipboard down on the counter, straightened the stack of papers without looking at them, and walked to the long table where the coin still rested. "Let's open this section," she said. Her voice was even quieter than before. "We've got room." No apology followed. No explanation. Just a small correction made out loud. Chairs shifted. One man scooted his seat back an inch to make space. Another lifted his tray and slid down the bench. Someone reached across the table to move a jacket out of the way. The changes were subtle, but they carried. Walter watched without intervening. The coin remained centered on the table, catching the light when someone leaned past it. No one touched it. No one needed to. A man who had laughed earlier stood with his tray in hand, hesitating. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, nodding toward the open space near Walter. Walter inclined his head. "Go ahead." The man sat, careful not to jostle the table. He glanced at the coin, then away again. "Didn't mean anything by it earlier," he said, keeping his eyes on his soup. "I know," Walter replied. That was all. Across the room, the teenage volunteer refilled water pitchers. She noticed how the laughter that returned stayed softer now, how jokes stopped short of crossing a line no one had named but everyone seemed to feel. A woman at the far end of the table caught Walter's eye and gave a small nod. Another man followed suit, tapping the edge of the table once in greeting. No one said anything about rank. No one needed to. The coordinator returned with a revised seating plan, slipping it into place without ceremony. "We'll keep it flexible," she said to a volunteer beside her. "Let people settle where they're comfortable." The volunteer nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Comfort took on a different meaning then. Plates were passed. Salt and pepper moved hand to hand. Someone offered extra bread to a neighbor who hadn't asked for it. The room found a new rhythm, one that didn't rely on laughter to hold it together. Walter reached forward and adjusted the coin, turning it slightly so it lay straight with the grain of the wood. He withdrew his hand and folded it in his lap. The older man in the veteran cap lifted his coffee cup in a small salute from across the table. Walter returned it with a nod. No one clapped. No one stared. Justice didn't arrive with raised voices or consequences handed down. It arrived with posture, with tone, with the quiet agreement of a room correcting itself. The man beside Walter cleared his throat. "You been coming here long?" he asked. "A while," Walter said. The man nodded. "Guess we all have." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Around them, the mess hall continued its work, serving, clearing, resetting, without the earlier edge. Someone laughed again, but this time it didn't spread. It stayed where it was light and contained. The teenage volunteer paused near the end of the table, looking at the coin one last time before moving on. She didn't know the history behind it. She didn't need to. She understood what it represented now, not authority, but responsibility, carried quietly. As the meal wound down, chairs were pushed back with care. Trays were stacked neatly. People lingered longer than they had planned, to conversations drifting instead of colliding. Walter stood and picked up his tray. He left the coin where it was for a moment longer, then slipped it back into his pocket before heading toward the return counter. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The mess hall carried on, changed just enough to matter. By late afternoon, the veterans' mess hall had begun to empty. Trays were stacked at the return counter. Chairs were pushed in with a care that hadn't been there earlier in the day. The noise thinned into something softer. Footsteps, a low murmur, the hum of lights overhead. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, laying long bands across the floor. Walter Hayes stepped outside without hurry. Across the street, the small church doors were open, and the choir had moved from warming up to singing in earnest. Their voices drifted through the open air, steady and unshowy, finding their way between buildings and settling wherever they could. Walter paused for a moment, listening, then walked on. Later that week, a small plaque appeared on the community bulletin board near the library entrance. It wasn't polished or ornate, just a simple piece of brass with a few lines etched cleanly into it. Most people passed by without stopping. A few slowed down, read it once, and nodded before moving on. On Saturday morning, the local radio station mentioned the luncheon in passing. No names. Just a brief note about turnout and volunteers and a line about how the room had felt different this time. Quieter. Better. The teenage volunteer heard it while riding with her mother, the radio low between songs. She didn't say anything, but she smiled and looked out the window as the town slid by. That evening, Walter sat on his porch as the sun eased down behind the trees. The porch swing creaked under his weight, a sound as familiar as breathing. He held the coin in his palm, turning it once, then letting it rest. The light caught its surface and softened it. He thought of the mess hall, the tables, the laughter, the pause, the way the room had shifted without being pushed, the way people had chosen quietly to do better. That mess hall stayed frozen a second longer. The words came to him without effort, like a memory already set in place. Down the street, a screen door slammed gently, and a neighbor waved. Walter lifted a hand in return. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler ticked back and forth. The choir's voices faded as rehearsal ended, replaced by evening sounds settling in. The teenage volunteer walked past with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She slowed when she saw Walter and stopped at the end of the walkway. "Mr. Hayes," she said. I think I understand now." He looked up. Understand what? She searched for the right words. "That rank isn't about being above people." Walter smiled, small and warm. "It's about standing where you're needed." She nodded, letting